Welcome to Unbiased America Live, episode 54, the greatest show that no one watches or has probably ever heard of. We are here with a regular know-nothing panel of Grant Phillips from We Are Capitalists and Kevin Ryan, who also, other than not knowing anything, is ugly. We have a special guest with us today, Dr. Robert Murphy. Um, Obviously, we're going to start off talking about what everybody's been talking about, which is the eventual end of the world, which is coming up pretty soon, technically in 2 years when Britain finally exits the European Union. But we did a few posts on this week. There's been back and forth. Some libertarians are favor of the EU because I think a lot of them think that the EU is free trade and that they're somehow the apex of free trade. And then there's some people that that favor state sovereignty, that the British people have every right to rule themselves, and you got this central authority in Brussels dictating to the British people some of their policies. And then you have people like me that think I think maybe Britain perhaps wanted to lower the barriers of trade to the EU and work to get freer trade with India, China, and perhaps the United States. And there's other countries like Iceland and Norway who are doing completely fine and have all the same free trade restrictions that the European Union has. Would you agree with that? I mean, is the European itself free trade? I mean, is this a bad thing for the UK to leave the European Union?
Okay, well, you throw a lot of questions. Thanks for having me, though, guys. So let me just take a bit of time. So, for sure, yeah, I think it's a mistake to say that being in the EU is the same thing as free trade, right? That Great Britain is left up. Farage giving that speech to the European Parliament saying, "Hey, okay, now that we voted to leave, it's time for us to make deals with each other. Let's have trade. Don't cut off your nose to spite your face." All right, as you mentioned, Switzerland's not in the EU. The United States is not in the EU. We have plenty of trade with Europe. So there's no necessary connection. Now, the EU might retaliate and levy a bunch of high tariff barriers kind of to say, oh, you're going to leave? Well, this is what happens, to kind of make an example of them. But they don't need to do that. And, in fact, it makes the other Europeans poorer when they do that. Right? So the case for free trade is unilateral. So it's not like if two countries are blockading it or have tariff barriers that they can say, all right, we'll lower our barriers and let your people sell stuff to us, but only if you reciprocate. Whether or not the other country reciprocates, your country is better off, at least the standard classical case, if you lower your barriers.
They both have incentive to maintain the same trade the policies that they already have. I mean, if one wants to go protectionist, they're only going to make themselves poor, and Britain is on an island. I mean, there's certain natural resources that they don't have that they need, and you'd start to get into retaliatory tariffs and so on and so forth. It seems like the incentives for both are to maintain the same trade policies, correct?
Yes. Now, what may be going on? I mean, part of the strategic give and take is the EU has a bunch of regulations on their businesses, and so you could understand like a business in Spain or something saying, "Wait a minute, if we have to comply with all these regulations, how can we compete?" And so, just like there's all kinds of people making those worries in the United States, and wait a minute, we can't just have unfettered free trade because look at the firms in India are paying their workers nothing, and but typically, libertarian free market economists would say those are silly arguments.
Right.
And if your government's hurting your business's competitiveness, the solution is to reduce those regulations, not to put up barriers and tax your people if they're trying to import goods from abroad.
Right. So outside the EU itself, the EU was kind of hostile to anyone not in that 28-member union. There were some smaller countries that it had some free trade deals with, but there might be some outside the EU, like Britain may want to trade with India, may want to trade with China, but somebody like one of the member nations of the EU may see that as threatening to an industry in their country and then block the trade deal, correct? So this made free trade to a degree somewhat cumbersome with outside nations.
Right. So my understanding is that before, if Great Britain wanted to, have a separate bilateral trade agreement with some other country, while they were still in the EU, technically they couldn't do that because you can't have the EU member states running off and doing stuff unilaterally. It's kind of got to be like as a bloc. So yes, one of the pro-Brexit arguments in favor of free trade was to say, yeah, we can't control what the EU does to us, and they're idiots. They might retaliate, but at least now we'll have the freedom to cut deals and lower trade barriers with every other nation in the world. Whereas before we couldn't. We kind of had to do it as a bloc.
Right. And the migrant worker thing, a lot of people here in the States, we like to project our politics onto everything in the world. And a lot of the people are saying already this is a nationalist, this is a protectionist, this is a populist, this is all kinds of horrible things that are going on. But I mean, I think I was listened to a Cato podcast a couple of days ago with one of their scholars, and he said that only about 15% of the vote was really that kind of a nationalist movement. A lot of it was that people just wanted, that the policy now, I think what Daniel Hanlon kind of elucidated, was that instead of just having migrant workers that don't have jobs, basically you just had people going wherever they wanted without having a job first, is that now to be admitted into the UK, you would have to have a job first in order to get there, instead of having that just movement of people without having jobs, kind of from wealth, like just having a massive welfare state, and trying to end that to a degree.
Yeah, so I agree. If you have this worldview that anybody who is for secession or these sorts of things, who is not a globalist, it's because you're a tribalist and you're probably a racist. If that's your attitude, you're going to be able to find that. You're going to be able to see examples of people on Facebook or something who are
Sure.
pro-Brexit saying stuff about, yeah, let's keep those people. But I think you're right. I was just over in Eastern Europe a couple months ago talking to people who were quite cosmopolitan, very classically liberal, and they were explaining, like, yeah, this situation's crazy, that with like the Syrian refugees, if any one country in the EU has a porous border and a liberal policy and lets them in, once they're in, they can just figure out which country in the EU has the best welfare policies and flock there. And by the normal rules, that country can't say, whoa, we're getting overwhelmed. So rules that were in place to allow free migration among EU states, it's in a weird situation now with all these outside refugees, understandably, because their country's in the middle of a war or whatever, has terrorist attacks coming in. So it's a bad situation. There's no good solution. But yeah, I think you're right that a lot of the people in the UK, it wasn't so much they were saying we're against immigrants or we're against even refugees. It's just we want to be able to set our own policies, not have to just do whatever the people in Brussels tell us.
Right, and would you agree, and I'll get to Kevin in a second, that a lot of the regulations, the regulatory board in Brussels, I mean, not only is it undemocratic, it's literally the antithesis of undemocratic to a degree. And not that all democracy is good, it's just that you have this bureau set up in Brussels that regulates all of these countries. They're heterogeneous cultures to a degree, and it would stifle innovation in a lot of these countries, stifle the laboratories of free trade, like putting certain restrictions on some industries that Britain perhaps does better than Spain, or Italy does better than Prague, or the Czech Republic. It's just kind of stifled that kind of innovative creativity of these separate cultures. Would you agree with that too? Is that?
Oh yeah, definitely. And again, it depends. There's different people making different kinds of arguments. Just like with the United States, I'm sure during the Civil War, the War of Southern Secession, or the War of Northern Aggression, whatever, depending on your framework, whatever you want to call it. Clearly, if you want to go into that and say, oh, the reason the South left is because of slavery, you can find tons of people writing and saying stuff like that. But if you want to say, no, they left because of the high tariff policy that was helping northern manufacturers and punishing southern exporters, you could find tons of people saying that too, right? So it was a complex thing, and if millions of people are voting on something, I'm sure there's lots of different motivations.
Right.
And so yeah, I think you're right. I mean, maybe an analogy that would help Americans think about it is right now we have a free trade zone of all the states, but certainly Washington, D.C. imposes all kinds of crazy regulations, and you could see, like, if Texas wanted to secede, and then they could say, well, there's pros and cons. What if the other 49 states then put up tariff barriers? But on the other hand, we don't have to do what the EPA and the SEC and the IRS and blah, blah, blah say. So I think that's kind of a good analogy.
And yeah, I mean, you can liken that to D.C., like the board in Brussels, the regulatory board in Brussels, and D.C. is the similar thing. I would just say that all 50 states would need to kind of have a movement to limit the federal government in our country, that the states need to take their autonomy back from Washington. I think that's a huge problem here. We have these regulatory boards, the EPA, this administrative state that is just clobbering the free market and clobbering capitalism. I mean, private property is not a thing anymore to a degree when you have the EPA coming in telling you where you could dig a hole in your property and where you're allowed to put the sand.
But yeah, so I think just like no, if you had gone back in 1920 and polled all the governors or whatever, the various states, and said, what do you think the proper balance is between what the federal government can do and what the states can do? And they told you, it would look a lot different from what it is right now in the United States. And so by the same token, I think when the EU was formed and all the states joined it and so on, they had no idea that as of 2016, Brussels would be intervening in their economies and setting these regulations up the way they are right now. So I think that's part of what has happened. Just you create a power center,
Right.
over time it just keeps expanding. I mean,
Essentially, what they created is a market for rent seeking.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty much it. It's like, let's concentrate all this power, and what happens when you have all this concentrated power? You have every corporatist within miles, you know what I mean, trying to get a break or enter into certain rent-seeking behavior so that they can increase their profits at somebody else's expense.
Yeah, and I think part of the analogy is even worse, in terms of, because at least like the people in Texas or Alaska or California, they have they vote for the president of the United States, so at least the executive of that whereas the people in Great Britain, it's not like they directly control the leadership of the EU. So
right.
I think that was part of the argument too, sort of like a no taxation or regulation without representation kind of thing.
And that's a solid argument. Kevin, I know you have a ton of questions. Go ahead.
I do, actually. It's a good time for this too, I think. We've talked about this a lot on the show, that there's this rising populism around the world, really, but in the U.S. and certainly in Europe right now. And you've got the UK Independence Party, you've got Trump, you've got Sanders, and they're all pushing what, in my opinion, is a very dangerous case against free trade. And we on the show, or Unbiased America in general, see ourselves as in the business of trying to sell the truth, sort of no matter what ideology it comes from. But I've never found, at least not recently, a harder truth to sell than free trade these days. I mean, everybody on both sides of the aisle is just going against it and is pushing things that I thought were no longer even going to be topics in the United States, frankly, ever again since the Depression. But we've got suddenly people talking about tariffs, and we've got people talking about closing borders, and people talking about closing trade. And
we're going to win again, Kevin.
Yeah, we're going to make America great again by going back to the Depression, apparently. But how do you counter that? I mean, how do you counter what has become a very strong populist case against free trade?
Yes, that's a great question. I noticed it with when Pat Buchanan was running for president. Obviously, like leftists who are against capitalism in general, it wouldn't surprise you if they are against free trade or something, or think that's just some apology for the capitalists or something. But what is interesting is how from the right, if you will, there are these populist objections to free trade. So I noticed it with Pat Buchanan. Paul Craig Roberts in the mid-2000s, he and I exchanged barbs a bit, because his point was the David Ricardo classical case for free trade assumed labor and capital were within each country and just goods crossed borders, and that was his classical comparative advantage case. And that those assumptions aren't true anymore. Companies can outsource. If a company can get doctors in India to diagnose you, look at your MRIs, and they just email this stuff back. He thought the assumptions changed, so he and I would go back and forth. And then now, with the rise of Trump, and there's plenty. I just on Tom Woods' show, rebroadcast, Tom was the moderator, where I debated Vox Day on the issue of free trade. So it's getting mixed in with. It's understandable, right, that like people could be against NAFTA because that wasn't just merely about lowering tariff barriers, right? That would just take an index card to say Mexico and the U.S. and Canada are going to lower tariff barriers. Instead, it was hundreds, maybe even 1,000+ pages of regulations and giving national sovereignty to these third-party organizations that were not directly accountable to the individual citizens. So in just people who are against globalism, you can understand why they would be. The move towards one world government and having a fiat currency issued by the World Bank or something. I mean, that's terrifying. And so you could see, and unfortunately, a lot of the same academics and intellectuals who are for that kind of stuff also understand the standard case for free trade and realize, if we could all mutually lower tariff barriers, that would allow the movement of goods around. So I think part of the issue, so you're right, the economics is still there, and I still am a staunch free trader, but I can understand why people who are concerned about like governments, like national governments kind of losing power at the expense of these international organizations that nobody can stop, and they're kind of owned by multinational corporations and stuff. If that's what you're afraid of, then you would look with suspicion on stuff like free trade agreements that are thousands of pages long, and they have a lot of stuff in there besides just lowering tariff barriers.
But I've noticed a sort of rising confusion amongst people about what exactly they're protesting against, and it reminds me of the people who are against capitalism because what they see as corporatism is strangling innovation and so forth in America. People confusing capitalism with corporatism. Yeah. I mean, people confusing the benefits of free trade with like you said, all the other parts of NAFTA, which you rightly say should you could get rid of all these regulations and exceptions to free trade and so forth. So I think I see a lot of confusion out there right now about what exactly people are protesting against, and both sides are taking advantage of this confusion to push their agenda and say, well, see, now capitalism is wrong. Capitalism is going wrong. Globalization is never working, and so forth. Even though it's been the greatest power in terms of alleviating poverty the world has ever seen. So I have one more question, and we'll go on to Grant, but come back to me after because I have another question about this.
All right, go ahead, Grant.
Well, I was just going to say, Kevin earlier was talking about the rise of sort of anti-trade populism, and I think a lot of it has to do with as trade expands, as globalization expanded, there are winners and losers to this. Factories in America shut down. I mean, I live in Philadelphia. You look at Philly, and there's empty factory building everywhere. And on net, I think our economy and society have definitely benefited from trade, and I'm also staunchly pro-trade. But I can see where that sort of almost a narratory argument upsets people and makes them angry because their dad lost their job that got outsourced to China, or their neighborhood steel mill was shut down and sent to Mexico, or that kind of thing. So I can see the frustrations that people have. I just don't think they realize the bigger picture, so to speak, and how that has actually benefited them and their children in the long run. And one of the analogy I always like to use is if you have two stores that are across the street from each other, and they both offer the exact same product, and one of them is $5 less, which one are you going to buy? And who would buy the one that's more expensive? No one would.
Right.
And I work in manufacturing. I can tell you right now, I outsource work all the time because it's cheaper. And if I outsource something, possibly hire another person. So I don't think that people can conceive that sort of trade-off and that the growth of the pie outside of seeing their neighborhood factory shut down. That's sort of their very narrow focus, and I think that's really what has given rise to Trump. I mean, I forgot it was an AC duct factory shut down recently and was sent to Mexico. I was up in arms about it. 10,000 people got laid off, whatever. I don't think people realize what goes into fabricating air conditioning duct. I mean, this is like sheet metal bending. Anyone can do that. Cheaper to do it overseas, that means lower building costs. That's a good thing. But what populists see is 10,000 people lost their job, and then it stops there. That's what we're really combating.
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right. It's problem the case for free trade. Yeah, it's easy to see the losers, right? Yeah, factory shuts down or whatever. It's hard to notice. We kind of just take it for granted how cheap stuff is at Walmart and how cheap we can get big plasma screen TVs or stuff that's made in China, and we just take it for granted. And, oh my God, look at the stuff your iPhone can do that Captain Kirk couldn't do some of that stuff. Back they didn't even imagine that those things would be possible. So all the benefits of innovation and outsourcing and all that stuff we just take for granted. That's life. And then when you see some specific thing that's not good, it's easy to say what caused that. Oh, it's globalization or whatever. So it gets a bad taste in your mouth. So that's true. But I think part of what's going on though is Americans, and then I'm sure people around the world too, kind of know something is screwed up with the economy. Like it shouldn't be so hard for us to make ends meet and look at healthcare costs, and this is crazy. And I have this insecurity, and if I get laid off, I'm not sure I'm going to get another job. And I agree that there's stuff is really wrong. It's not just like it's in everybody's head. It's just they're falsely attributing it to globalization when really, it's a lot of these statistics, for example, that the anti-free trade people will use, like this guy Box Day I debated. He was like, yeah, middle class wages peaked in 1973 or so. I think that was the And I pointed out, well, it's not like there was this wave of free trade legislation that hit in the mid-'70s. No, that was when Nixon was doing, top-down wage and price controls and took us off the gold standard. So I do agree something qualitatively got worse with the distribution of wealth in the United States, but I think not coincidentally that was when the federal government, unshackled the Federal Reserve to print money like crazy, and also had a new wave of peacetime regulations that was pretty much, that was unparalleled in some respects, the way they intervene in the energy sector. So I would say things like that it's, and unfortunately, like some tenured economist from George Mason or something who comes forward and says, wait, I can show you a diagram on the blackboard, and let's assume there's two countries with two goods, and then this happens, see? That you just lost your job, and some tenured professor's talking to you about some crazy model, you're going to get angry, so.
Actually, I think this is what my question I was going to come back to, which is a good time to ask it now. How do you, how do you quantify the cost versus benefit of something like free trade? You obviously have to look at the costs of lost jobs, but you have to look at the benefit of reduced cost of living. Is it as simple as that? Obviously it's not as simple as that, but when we're trying to present a case to our audience, sometimes I look at real compensation as a good blanket indicator of the direction that society is headed in, whether or not the lost wages are being compensated for by the reduced the cost of living. Is there something? Is there a better way of quantifying the whether or not there's a net benefit or cost to free trade?
Well, there's at least two problems whenever you try to do something like that. Like if you're trying to assess the impact of, hey, they made some new trade deal, and we're looking at the before and after, and how do we figure out whether it was a good thing or a bad thing? So two things is, one, it could affect different people differently, and so if some people gain and some people lose, how do you try to aggregate that, or do you just say like, oh well, as long as the losses aren't too bad, or do you say we need to compensate the people? So that's one problem, and the other is you don't know what the counterfactual would be if they hadn't done that policy change, right? It's not so much to say let's look 5 years after NAFTA and look at 5 years before, because maybe in that 10-year span, if they hadn't done NAFTA, people would have gotten richer still. You know what I mean? So really, what you theoretically should be comparing it to is the universe where we went down a different path, and what would the people be like over there, which we can't observe, right? So a lot of this stuff, it's like with the Obama stimulus package, we can't just go look and count up all the jobs and see whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, because really what we need to know is what would have happened if they hadn't done it. And
yeah, but isn't that your job? Isn't that your job as an economist, to make that hypothetical, to do a study, to figure out exactly the cost benefit analysis, and to figure out a way to quantify the net effects of something like a NAFTA or a TPP or something?
Well, sure. But I'm saying we can't observe it though. So, like for example, economists did come out years after the Obama stimulus package, like the CBO or whoever, and said, here you go, it saved or created, and they gave some number of how many million jobs. And the press, reported that. But the way they did it is they took the same models that they used before it passed, which projected all the job gains, and they just updated it with some of the, like with the latest GDP numbers and stuff. So, the model was still, it's like saying, what if, you could say, ask historians, what if the U.S. had stayed out of World War II? What would have happened?
Am I hearing the Austrian come out of you right now?
Yeah. So I want to make sure people get that. Whereas like in physics and chemistry and stuff, if they have different theories, ideally you could have a laboratory experiment and run the experiment one way, then keep everything the same and tweak one little thing and do that, and then see who's right or who's wrong. We can't turn the clock back and not do the Obama stimulus and then see what happened. So yeah, economists might lead the public to believe they're doing what you said, but they actually can't. All they can do is have models that predict this is what would have happened otherwise. Look at reality, look at what would have happened, and see my idea was good. But that's because the model they chose built into the assumptions that their policy is good. So I'm not even saying they're lying. Like, they might not even realize that's what they're doing, but that is what they're doing. So like that's why Paul Krugman and I would still disagree about the Great Depression, even though you'd think we've had decades of data and stuff since then. How can we not know? Well, because again, you can't go back in time and have Herbert Hoover be a laissez-faire guy. We don't know what would have happened.
Yeah, Hubert Hoover was also a progressive, and he sounds a lot like Donald Trump when he gave his speech the other day about protectionist policies and so on, which is kind of scary. But where do you stand on this British exit? I would call it Brexit if I was a tabloid newspaper and I was talking about a Hollywood couple, but I can't bring myself to do it.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it sounds like Brangelina.
Right? That's what this is. It's like Brennifer. I'm just not going to do it. So it's a British exit. Where do you stand on it from a cost-benefit scenario a couple of years down the line?
I think it's a good thing because not so much for the particulars of that case, but just in general, I think the only hope for individual liberty and economic freedom over the next 10, 20 years are secessionist movements. And I know that's a dirty word, but that's what it was. I mean, the colonists breaking away from Great Britain, that was secession. So, in other words, I don't think you're going to get the elites to change their mind. I don't think you're going to just get a bunch of angry people who are going to vote enough to change the central organs of power. I think people who are really concerned about their liberty are going to have to break away from the larger groups. And then when you have a bunch of smaller groups with competition and stuff, they'll have to not be so crazy in terms of the regulations and taxes, because otherwise people will move out to neighboring jurisdictions. And so, I mean, I think at least that's what I was taught as to where did political liberty, why did it come from Europe and not like China? It wasn't because the people in Europe were wise and noble. It was because of the geography and whatever, that they had all these little small jurisdictions fighting with each other and vying for power. And so then it just resulted in, they had to have reasonable policies in order to get population growth and so forth. And so that's what the idea of limited government, where that came from. It wasn't somebody planned it. It was just kind of a spontaneous outgrowth of the fact that they had all these fragmented little jurisdictions, whereas like in China it was this huge, thing ruled by, one person on top.
All right, I kind of want to change speeds here and switch topics and go to Keynesian economics. You and Tom Woods do a weekly podcast called Contra Krugman, where you debunk Krugman's op-eds in the New York Times. There's a lot of people out there, certainly young people, that think that any sort of macroeconomics is Keynesian economics. So can you give us a short little answer on what exactly Keynesian economics is? What's the premises of Keynesian economics?
Sure. So the term Keynesian derives from the economist John Maynard Keynes. In 1936, he had a really famous book called The General Theory that came out. And so remember, in the 30s, that was in the midst of the Great Depression. So his book comes out, and Keynes said, hey, the classical school, we're good at explaining things, during full employment, but I'm giving a more general theory, and I'm showing how aggregate demand, like total spending, can fall below the level needed to employ everybody, and the market can get stuck in a rut for years at a time, and it's not going to fix itself. And so there's a role for the government to come in and to deficit spend and fill that gap, so there's enough spending to employ everybody.
And nobody laughed at that at the time?
Well, no, they didn't laugh. Well, some people may have, but it was very effective rhetorically, because like the general theory is kind of like Einstein, his theory of relativity. He wasn't saying Newton's laws were wrong. He was just saying they're only true,
right,
for low mass and speeds not close to the speed of light. And so that's what Keynes was. He was saying, like, Adam Smith and David Ricardo and those guys, they're not wrong, and JB say they're not wrong. It's just their theories are true for full employment situations. I'm giving a more general framework. So nowadays you just see it all the time. Like when the financial press in November is looking at the consumer spending data, like, we don't know if there's enough spending, but retailers aren't going to be able to get into the black this year, and who knows about fourth quarter GDP? Because remember, consumption 70%. So there, you almost get the idea that if it were just Christmas every month of the year, we would never have a recession. If people would just blow their paychecks at the mall, everything would always be fine. When wait a minute, that's crazy. That can't be right.
Right.
So
we'll get into JB Say in a minute. I actually kind of want to get into that. But at the time, too, when he wrote General Theory, you kind of had this anti-market sentiment, too. You had the Great Depression, just like the Great Recession in 2008. It was blamed largely on the free market. Even professors at the Chicago School were really kind of timid in advocating market policies at this time for fear of being ridiculed, to a certain degree. I know Angus Bergen from Johns Hopkins wrote a good book on it called Free Markets After the Great Depression, and he actually includes the London School of Economics with Lionel Robbins and Hayek's reaction to Keynes, which is really good. If you don't have it, I would advise getting that book. But I mean, just to get a sense of the anti-market sentiment at that time, kind of. Also, you had governments that wanted to grow and get bigger, and what's what's better than Keynesian economics to give governments more centralized power, right? I mean, here they have the control over investing, what to invest in, where to invest, how much to invest, what to do with the currency. And isn't it true that the Keynesians today even have gone further than Keynes would have ever gone with their pump priming and stimulus?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, like for one example, Keynes thought that the government should run a deficit during times of depression or recession, and then run a surplus during boom periods, like so the government's debt over the whole business cycle doesn't go up. Whereas today's Keynesians, even though they pay lip service to that, a lot of them are talking about, well, we don't ever need to pay off the debt. You know, why would we have to do that? You know, as long as
That's silly.
you know, as long as the deficit as a share of GDP stays within a certain range, you know, what would ever happen? You know, the U.S. is, you know, the creditors aren't doubting the U.S. Treasury. Why wouldn't we just run deficits forever? So yeah, in that respect, they're kind of pushing it beyond things that Keynes himself used to say. You know, the stuff about $1 trillion platinum coin. I don't know if that was on your radar a few years ago when there was the debt debate, and somebody was saying,
right.
well, the Constitution gives the government the authority to coin money, so why don't we just take a platinum coin, put $1 trillion on it, and put that in the Federal Reserve, and now Uncle Sam can spend $1 trillion. You know,
that's how it works, right? I mean, isn't that how wealth isn't money, right? You know, isn't that where it comes from? Just print more of it, and you have more
just
wealth.
declare it. I mean, so I think, yeah, in some respects, but Keynes had a famous passage where he said, if nothing else were to happen, it would be good for the government to take bottles, put cash in them, and then bury it in a trash heap, and then let private business hire workers to dig up the bottles to get the money, and that would be better than doing nothing. Which is, you know, insane, but like that was the logical extreme to which he went. So he wasn't saying that. He would say it'd be better if you had the workers build bridges and schools and stuff, but he was saying if you were going to do nothing or bury money in trash, I would rather you bury money in trash because at least that would then stimulate employment.
Right. I think we should just start building just a ton of bridges out of nowhere. I mean, the economy's kind of floundering. We've had a tepid recovery. Let's just build bridges and swing sets and stuff, and then everything will be much better. I mean, am I right?
Paul Krugman would say so.
That is insane. That is complete insanity. Kevin, I know you have some questions about Keynesian economics. Go ahead.
I do. You know, I've thought, well, you talked about how they really only apply one half of what Keynes said, which is the spending, and they don't ever really refer to what to do in times of expansion, which Keynes said, you know, start building up a surplus. And I've noticed that. I mean, what's happened, and this isn't just for Keynesian theory. This is for most economic theories these days. Is you get politicians who come in, and they take a theory, and they color it with their own ideology. They essentially try to manipulate it to fit to whatever their needs are, the political needs are at the time. And that's, I think, how you're getting a lot of this. And that's how Keynes suddenly became popular again, was because you had a lot of governments trying to figure out ways to increase their budgets and increase their surplus. I mean, cut me off if I'm wrong here, but it seems like it basically, instead of being used as a way to fix a problem, it's been used as a justification, as a means to an end. And that's what I think happened to Keynesian theory, is that it got applied by people who were looking at it not for a solution, but for their own greed, for their own individual needs. Am I saying anything wrong here that you hear so far?
I don't think there's anything wrong. I mean, it depends, and probably with various people, you know, there's a spectrum. So certainly, I think like Franklin Roosevelt would be like, oh yeah, this is great. This book, you know, justifies the stuff I wanted to do anyway for reasons of my own personal power. And yeah, if we can come up with some scientific justification for expanding spending that will shut up these other economists and their objections, by all means, let's go ahead and do that. And so when you wonder why is it that major universities, that, you know, state universities and stuff, are more typically having economists, and why would it ever make sense? Would you expect all the economists on the Fed's payroll to favor the abolition of the Federal Reserve? Or would you say probably the economists who literally work for the Fed believe the Fed should exist? So, you know, when you do that, part of it's just a selection mechanism that, you know, if you think the Fed's great and you just think you should tweak its policies, you're going to be more likely to try to work there just so you sleep at night and get promoted. but also there's some cynicism involved too, that the Fed's not going to be stupid. They're not going to hire economists who are out publishing papers saying we should just go back to gold and silver. So I think it's the same kind of thing, that there's that symbiotic relationship where, yeah, I mean, so Keynes's book, he had some very clever argument. He was a very sharp guy, so that's why his book was the one that was leading the battle cry, and not some other guy's book that was a bunch of silly things. I mean, Keynes' book had a lot of silly stuff, I would say, but also it was done in a very clever way. And also, again, you guys were alluding to this, it came out in the middle of the 30s when people thought the market had just failed for years on end. And so that was kind of the climate. So we there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, FDR was already, if we're talking about the U.S., FDR had already been in office for years, and so you could say, well, how the heck is that the free market? He was doing the New Deal and it wasn't working. What more do you need to show that interventionism is bad? But yet, again, people's bias. If you think the market was failing and the government's helping, then the more stuff that Hoover and FDR were doing and it wasn't working, you'd say that just proved how messed up the market was. We need more help.
Yeah, and you could you could draw the same parallel to the housing crisis. I mean, was it a failure of free market? Was it or was it government interventionism that eventually blew up? And you could say the same things for a lot of the Keynesian policies that are going forward right now. At what point does it blow up? I mean, at what point Krugman said we didn't go far enough. Right. He's repeatedly said we have not spent enough.
Like, just to give you, in case your listeners don't know, I mean, it's hilarious. So both on the front and the back end, the Keynesians were wrong with the stimulus and austerity. With the Obama stimulus package, they did the Keynesian models or whatever, and on the front cover of it, or the front section, they had a chart, and this was like Christina Romer, she was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the time, and they were showing two different paths, and saying, if we don't do this, and we just sit back and do nothing, unemployment will reach such and such. But fortunately, if we do intervene and do this package, we'll limit the rise. So they went ahead and did the Obama stimulus package, and actual unemployment went up higher than what they were warning people would happen if we did nothing. So you would think, what more evidence would you need that this was bad? But of course, they just said, oh, the economy was worse than we realized. And thank goodness we passed the stimulus package, because otherwise unemployment would have been 18%. Right? And then the mirror image happened on the other end, like when the congressional Republicans put in the sequester and all that stuff, and there actually was fiscal restraint, for a 2-year period there, and there was Keynesian analyses coming out warning of all, like, if the sequester kicks in, this is how bad the economy is going to be. If we don't do it, the economy will still grow at such and such. Well, the sequester kicked in, and the economy did better than what these Keynesian analyses said would happen if we didn't do the stupid sequester. So again, you would ask, what more would have to happen to show that you were totally wrong? But they said, oh, the economy was actually a lot healthier than we realized. Thank goodness, because that sequester was stupid. If the economy had been as bad as we thought,
yeah, they're doing such a great job.
Yeah, so
essentially, like Kevin said, you can draw the parallels. I mean, isn't just George W. Bush the Hoover to Barack Obama's FDR with the same respect?
Yeah, and so that's you're giving me a good opportunity to plug my book. So I have the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and New Deal, and Regnery, the publisher, came to me because in late 2008, people were saying Bush is Hoover, Obama is FDR, and they meant that as a good thing, that Bush was was the do-nothing Hoover who gave us the Great Depression, and then Obama is the FDR who got us out of the depression. And so, my book pointed out, that analogy is good, because Hoover was the most interventionist peacetime president in history to that point, and that's why after the 29 stock market crash, it didn't bounce back after 18 months the way it had after all previous financial panics.
But didn't tariffs make America great again at that time? The Smoot-Hawley tariffs? They made I thought that's what we won again.
Bueller, no.
Right. Trump did a speech. It sounded, all about protectionism. We need to win. China manipulates their currency. Apparently, we don't manipulate ours. I don't know. What is, we talked about this earlier, and I don't know what you think, Grant, but I bring this up a lot, is that the left in this country, it's no longer the party of JFK, who lowered taxes in 1961, gave us deep tax cuts. The left is really a European left party. It's really this globalist, more, I would say Keynesian, but it seems to be moving more towards Marx. Look at the fervor you had for Bernie Sanders. And now you have this reactionary European right party of this kind of nationalist populist party, which is really a progressive populist party at this point. But I mean that you kind of have that's kind of the structure we have here. We have what Europe has had for decades now, to a degree, and I think that's part of where this protectionism's coming from. Is that it's just largely a reaction from the American left moving further to the left, that European left style, and just completely abandoning the party of JFK in the past.
I agree. I think the EU in itself was just a Keynesian wet dream. I mean, it still is today, and that sort of same general theory that Keynes published that began in the Great Depression, as we were saying earlier, is a huge parallel to the stimulus package, and even to the policies that followed that with Obamacare, the expansion of the welfare state. I mean, this is like FDR 101 over here. Run roughshod over the Constitution to get whatever you need through Congress. Maybe swipe a few executive orders through, and what do you have now? You have a huge, very far left Democratic Party. I think even Hillary Clinton is just as far left as Bernie Sanders in a lot of ways. Just she's a little bit more nuanced about it, maybe. And
sure, she's an in the closet Marxist, whereas Bernie was.
Yeah, at least he came out of the closet. So.
Yeah.
And even the Republican Party has moved very far left. It's almost to the point where I would really consider them more. And I hate the word moderate, but I would consider them more of a middle of the road party, with half of them split to the left and the other half teetering to conservative. And I think that the reason is because of this is that's what caters to a general public, especially one that's experiencing economic turmoil in their own ways and in their own households. And when you tag catchphrases onto that and back it up with what we believe is shoddy economics and what really is shoddy economics, you have a Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton nationalist right and Marxist left, really, is what it boils down to, and it's given birth to where we are today. And I think the Great Depression comparison is very valid, and I'm going to read Bob's book now that I know where I can get it.
Oh yeah, and also Bob's book is also his newest book, I think, right? His Choice.
Mm-hmm.
Choice, Cooperation. I'm sorry, let me get the name. So Choice, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action, and you can get that on Amazon and also at the Independent Institute. You can buy it from there. I wanted to get this one question in before we run out of time. It's speaking of politics. It's mainly a political rhetoric per se. Is trickle-down economics, quote unquote. I have an economics degree. I've never once heard. Coincidentally, I have an economics degree and a political science degree, and I always like to say I never heard the term trickle-down economics in any of my economics classes. Where I did hear trickle-down economics was in all of my political science classes. Mm-hmm. So I would always challenge a teacher and say, I'd say, I'm in the economics department, I don't know what that is. Can you please explain to me what trickle-down economics is? I could never get an explanation. Right. Where does that come from? Is that a conflation of Say's law of markets? Is that, or is that just a rhetorical device to make, markets and capitalism look bad?
I think it's the latter. So you're right. I haven't done like a nexus search or something, but I've definitely for sure seen like right-wing conservative writers saying that was a smear term, like to denounce. I think it came into currency during the Reagan years, right? So what is true is you had Arthur Laffer, advising like Jude Wanniski and stuff, and there was the Kemp-Roth tax cuts, and so the way those were motivated is to say that it was across the board percentage cuts, right? If you look at what the marginal income tax rates were by bracket, before the cut and then after, they lowered the rates in percentage terms. Like, so, the rate was what it was, and then lowered like 25 percentage points, something like that, or 25%, I should say. And so, yes, various ways of looking at it, it was a bigger tax cut for the rich, but if you're starting out where the rich are paying, 70% of all the income taxes, how the heck can you make a change that isn't going to favor them in that sense? But it was tax cuts for everybody. And then it is true that, when challenged, like, won't this be bad for the poor or something, a lot of right-wingers would say, well, this is going to unleash entrepreneurs and there's going to be job creation. What are you talking about? You want to unshackle business people so they can create jobs, and that's the best way to raise incomes in poor community. So they said stuff like that. I don't think anybody was ever stupid enough, just in terms of being tone deaf, to say, oh, let's give a bunch of money to rich people and some of it will trickle down, to the poor minorities in the inner city. Nobody ever said that who was for it. That was always a way to caricature, to straw man what their policy was. So I think that's what happened.
So just to be clear, I mean, you're at a couple of think tanks now. You have your doctorate in economics. Did you ever take a class on trickle-down economics?
Oh, absolutely not. No, that was
okay.
never.
Because
like
I just want to.
I don't even think anyone ever used the phrase. I think the closest thing is people would say stuff like a rising tide lifts all boats. I've definitely heard like pro supply side. So the terms would be things like the Laffer curve, which would say if you start out with really high rates and lower the tax rates, you might get more total revenue, which is kind of counterintuitive to some people. So his point was, you could call something a tax cut that actually might bring in more revenue to the government. And so that's a win-win. So why wouldn't we do that? And so what if it gives more dollars to rich people than poor people? If the poor people end up with more money, who cares? Stuff like that. And it also could be called supply-side economics, and they were doing that to distinguish it from Keynesian demand-side. But yeah, the trickle-down, like I said, I don't even think anyone who was for it ever even used that phrase, and certainly that's not like a separate theory or something.
I did have a Keynesian macroeconomics teacher, and I remember he was it was like the first day of class, and he was going over all these Keynesian theories and so on. And I walked up to him at the end of class. I said, do you think Say's law holds true? What's that? He said to me, and I'll never forget that. Here's a guy that went to, I think it was UCSD. University of California at San Diego, and I said, do you think Say's law? What's that? I just couldn't believe that a macroeconomics teacher had no idea what Say's law was, and then through the rest of the semester, then I started to understand how he had no idea what Say's law is. Can you explain just briefly what Say's law is? Which is the brainchild of the what they call supply side economics?
Sure. So, and by the way, for Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom, I have a course on history of economic thought. If you want to learn more. But yeah, so J.B. Say was a French economist in the 1800s, and he had this thing called, which would translate as the law of markets. And so he was pointing out, he was saying when there's a depression, there's trade is poor, the average merchant will say, oh, there's a scarcity of money. If only there was more money in circulation, or if only my customers had more demand, then things would be fixed. And so Say was just walking through the logic of that and saying, no, really what it is, if we all just produce twice as much stuff and traded with each other, that would be good. So it's not like there's too much production and not enough demand. What happens in a recession is maybe some sectors produce too much, but then others produce too little. So, why are we so much richer now than we were 100 years ago? It's because all the different sectors are producing more stuff and we're trading it with each other. And so Say's law, there's different versions, but it was basically saying the way ultimately when you demand somebody else's products, what you're doing is you're producing your own stuff. And then, yeah, you sell it for money and then use the money to buy that. But ultimately, the way the baker gets shoes is by bringing bread to market. And so that's what Say was getting at, saying, it's not just a general lack of spending. If we're poor, it's because we're not producing enough.
Right, so you first have to create something in order to subsequently demand something, right? I can't demand anything if I don't have anything to trade, right?
Right, exactly.
If I don't have a service to sell, or if I haven't created, again, like you said, the baker, if I don't bake any bread, what can I demand in a marketplace?
Right, exactly. So in terms of the history of thought, though, then Keynes in his book sort of straw man Say's law and, I think knocked down a weak version of it and kind of said, oh, he thought just automatically you produce something and then you're going to be able to sell it. Well, no, you can't, so...
When I read his book, that book, The General Theory, it was hard for me not at some point to throw it across the room and think, people really bought this? Some of the stuff that he had in there. Not that the whole book was terrible. Okay, the whole book was terrible. But there was just some stuff in there that really boggled my mind, as if they forgot a lot of the history of economic thought, the things we had already kind of progressed through. It was a throwback, really, is what it was, to a period before Say, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
But again, just to understand culturally or whatever how that happened,
right?
If you're in the midst of a depression and you think Say is telling you markets will clear, you can't have a general, you can't have a period for very long where just merchants can't sell stuff in general, and then it looked like, well, that's what we've had for 6 years, you idiot. So,
right. Go ahead, Kevin. I know you have some questions.
Yeah, and actually right now you have a situation, well, not now, but this has been the running war for decades now, where you have the supply side versus demand side advocates, and what they've created is essentially diametrically opposed policies where the demand side people are saying, well, we've got to give money to the people who don't have it, and for lack of a better way of explaining it. And what that ends up doing is disincentivizing production. It ends up disincentivizing people who would otherwise go out and bake bread to make, and to use your analogy, to create bread to get shoes. And instead, they're being handed paper dollars, and they're using those to sit there and not work. And you look at now, this is debatable, but you look at the labor force participation rate, and that certainly has been going down. And I know there's a lot of reasons for this, but it certainly doesn't help that you've got so many new policies coming out that essentially are geared towards demand side policies where people are just told you don't need to work. It's okay to stay home. Here, we'll help you out. Sit there and don't produce. And because of that, is it getting better or worse? Is the world getting better or worse when we do things like that? Obviously, I think there's a place for demand side, but I don't think that it's...
I don't.
Well, I think that it can work in the short term. What I'm saying is, look at the state of the world.
Yeah, so I mean, there's like the moral element too. That just whether or not the economics are true, you could say, what businesses are the government coming and taking money from some people and handing it to these people over there? So that's one thing.
Right.
Then, yeah, in terms of just the standard, neutral economic science of it, you're right that how can it be a good idea? What happens when there's a recession is there's, a lot of people are out of work and businesses don't want to hire them, and so how do you fix that? And what happens with a lot of these policies is they levy taxes and regulations on the businesses and the people who have money, so now they don't have the incentive to hire as many workers. Like Obamacare, if you have more than 50 employees now, there's extra hurdles. It's a lot more expensive to hire another employee. And so the employee's going to have to be a lot more productive to make it worth your while to hire them than before. And then at the same time, if you're giving all this, extra welfare benefits and things like that to unemployed people, only if they're unemployed, right? If they get a job, then all of a sudden they lose their benefits. So you're literally paying them to not have a job. And so you could, it's, what do you think's going to happen? So to be clear, there are some like Chicago school economists that you end up thinking they just explain the whole Great Recession, and they're saying that's what it was. And no, I mean, I subscribe to Austrian business cycle theory. I think there would have been a recession, there would have been high unemployment, people would have been out of work for a while they were, resources were getting reallocated. But then on top of that, if you lay on all these incentive problems, that's just going to delay the recovery and screw everything up even more.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, let's have healthcare, right? You know what I mean? Just
yeah,
really
and
healthcare.
The dwindling amount of healthcare available. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's something too that, I wouldn't surprise you. I think over the next 10, 15 years, there's going to be growing calls for single payer because people are going to say, look, private markets are not working. Yep. And yeah, in the real, the actual experience is going to show they're not working. I mean, just one example that I like to give is if you were a health insurer right now, somebody with brain cancer comes up, it is illegal for you to deny them a policy, and you can't even charge them more than a comparable person without brain cancer. So what are you going to do? You're not just going to lose $50,000 on them. You're going to tell your people, figure out who the best cancer doctors in our area are and make sure they're out of network, because we don't want this person applying, and if he does, we want to stick it to him and charge him all these fees because he's going out of network. And so that person's going to be outraged, call him up, there's going to be no one answering the phone because they got rid of all their customer service people to save costs. And they're not going to get mad at Barack Obama or Jonathan Gruber. They're going to get mad at the health insurance company that's so evil that doesn't have the good cancer doctor in network.
Well, right, profits are evil.
When people tell me that the private market has failed in health insurance or in healthcare, my immediate reaction is, what private market?
Right.
What
when?
Market healthcare are you talking about? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't see it anywhere. I mean,
right.
I don't even know what my healthcare premium is because I get it through my employer. I'm not out shopping for healthcare or health insurance, really. I'm not out price shopping. What price system of exchanges do we have in it? I just don't see it. That's always my reaction.
Your experience has colored your beliefs, essentially.
Yeah.
Right. Even though it doesn't necessarily mean what your interpretation of what's happened is true.
Right, exactly. I mean, I have way better healthcare than Will, for example. I mean, he just goes on WebMD and then,
pretty much
pills from some guy under the bridge. But
thank you, Internet, for saving my life several times. You know what I mean? And by saving my life, I mean I take pills that are unmarked. I don't know what they are, and I tend to get sick, and then I have to fix that problem. It sounds like how government fixes most of its problems, creates the problem, and then tries to fix it, really. But I have one final question.
Okay.
The left despises profits. Can you just tell the audience how profits help to allocate resources, that profits aren't a bad thing, that they've just been demonized for obvious political reasons?
Sure. So think of it like this. We have a system, right? We want to have freedom. You want to have, if some individual comes up with a new product or has a new idea for making a service, providing a service for people, you don't want them to have to get permission from the government to set up a factory and start trying that thing. But on the other hand, there's only a finite amount of resources. You can't have people just going off and doing crazy stuff that wastes a bunch of, rubber and labor power and iron ore and stuff to produce things that nobody wants. So how do you reconcile those two things? Well, you have private property and the profit and loss system. And so you're free. You have the legal freedom to buy up a bunch of resources and do whatever you want with them. You don't have to get approval from some commissar. But if the consumers are not willing to give you enough money for the thing you're making so that over time you can then use those dollars or whatever the money is to then pay the resource owners and still be left with money left over, then you go out of business, right? So that is the mechanism by which we protect society's scarce resources, so that just a few people, cranks who go off with crazy ideas, don't waste all the resources, but yet we still retain the freedom that if you have an idea that's different from the crowd, you're allowed to test it out and see if it works. So what a profit is a signal that's saying you're taking resources that cost $1 million and you're making something that the consumers value at $2 million. So that $1 million profit, in a sense, is a signal saying you just added that much value.
Right.
So yeah, there's all kinds of things you could say. Well, there's lots of stuff that you don't buy with money. There's family and your relationships and stuff. Sure, but there's a lot of stuff that you do buy with money, and this is like one mechanism of sort of like keeping score and making sure you're not squandering resources. And that's
right. So it's about it's about the efficiency of the allocation of scarce resources, right? And the more efficient it is, the higher of standard of living for everybody, right? You have less squandered resources.
Right, that we need, there's thousands of entrepreneurs running around different operations that are all sucking the available resources out and turning them into different things. So we need some mechanism to steer the resources towards the people who are doing a better job, where better job is ultimately defined by the public and how they shop for stuff.
Right, so profits aren't out to get me and my family and try to kill us in our sleep or anything?
Right, so, ultimately, if you have a problem with the market's allocation mechanism, the profit and loss system, you have a problem with how people are spending their money, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're saying, I can't believe Justin Bieber is rich and famous and this violinist down here that I know who goes to my local symphony isn't world famous, that's not a problem with the profit and loss system. It's just the people who buy Justin Bieber's records or whatever and not this violinist, they're the ones you should be complaining about.
Right.
Because they have bad taste in your mind and they don't spend their money correctly. But it's not the market mechanism which rewards people based on, if more people want to throw dollars at you, you're going to end up with more money. Well, yeah, that's what's going to happen.
I mean,
all right.
Telling me crazy, but I want to get paid for what the work that I'm going to put into something. If I'm going to take all this risk in a business, and I'm the bad guy because I want to maybe make a little bit extra on the top.
Well, you're a bad guy just because you're you, and partly because you want profits. Obviously, you're an evil human being. Kevin, do you have anything else to say?
No, I just want to thank Dr. Murphy. I mean, it's an honor to have you on here. We're all big fans.
Oh, thanks, guys.
What are your latest books you have out?
So Choice is one of them, and then on the healthcare stuff, it's called The Primal Prescription, where it's a co-authored with an ER doctor, Doug McGuff, and so that's on Amazon if you want, where we diagnose what happened with the U.S. healthcare and health insurance system, and then he has a lot of stuff in there about how do you take charge of your own health. So he's a big fan of the Primal Blueprint, so that's why the title is The Primal Prescription. But my role in that book is an economist giving an outline of what the heck went wrong with healthcare. Is it a market failure? Is Obamacare going to make things better or worse? That kind of stuff.
All right, and buy Dr. Murphy's book Choice. Also, Dr. Murphy will be at Freedom Fest, which starts July 13th. I'll also be at Freedom Fest July 13th. There's a party right at Planet Hollywood that Friday night, a karaoke party. I probably wouldn't want to go up and sing because I'd make everybody else feel really badly because I'm an excellent singer. So I'll let everyone else go and do their thing.
Bring
But,
it.
yeah. But thanks so much for coming on. I'll be on Tommy Lawrence show tomorrow, representing Unbiased America, which is on the Blaze TV at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Visit unbiasedamerica.com. Also, Unbiased America Facebook page. You can follow Dr. Murphy on Facebook as well. You have your own personal page there, right?
Yeah.
And-
Just look for Robert P. Murphy. I forget what the
Right.
thing is, but yeah.
And what's your Twitter handle? I'm sorry.
Bob Murphy Econ.
All right, and you can check my Twitter handle. You can see it on unbiasedamerica.com. His Twitter handle will be on there as well. Thanks for coming on. Also follow We Are Capitalists. That's where Grant is, who's obviously trying to copy my beard, but he can't quite pull it off. All right, thank you for coming, and we'll see you next week, guys. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.